Hi there. Welcome to Kari's Confessions, a nonprofit executive tells all. Yep, I'm Kari Anderson. I am the principal of Insight Consulting Group and a recovering nonprofit executive director. I'm so happy you're joining me on my podcast. I want to share a little bit quickly about me and why this information might be relevant for you, and then we'll jump into today's topic matter. So I'm a Montanan. I'm a proud former staff member, current board member, and consultant. I've worked in this sector for my entire career, and I think it's one of the best possible places that we can be if we want to make a difference in our communities. I also recognize this sector is taxing and lonely, and that doesn't matter whether you're in a small town or a large town. My hope through this podcast is that we've got an opportunity to share some stories, share some tools, laugh a little, and refill your bucket as you're moving into your work week. Today's topic is really the impetus of why I chose to launch this podcast, and that is really getting some clarity around what your job is as an executive director and giving you some toolkits and a primer to be able to do your best work. So as we launch in today, I want you to kind of think about the overarching question I'm going to ask right now. Did you know what you were getting into when you started this job? Many of us received a job description that was 10 pages long, 12-point font, single spaces, but we never really got a playbook in terms of understanding what our role was. And then there's some nuances that go along with this work that differ whether you're in a small shop and you're one staff person with a small board, or whether you move into a much larger organization where that you've got a board of 20 or 30 and you've got a staff of 40. There's still some overlying best practices and principles when you're an executive director, and I want to share what those are today. So think really quickly, first of all, where's that job description? That might be something that you might want to reference, either with a laugh after we've gone through today's session, or to be able to compare it to say, I might need to do some upgrading to this, because we have this habit as leaders in our organizations of adding more and more and more to that job description, or our boards are inadvertently adding more and more and more without really using a grounding exercise every year of what are my core responsibilities. So there's kind of homework item number one for you today, and this will be an eventual takeaway that I ask you to think about at the end of today's podcast, and that is, do I know what my core responsibilities for work are? I would absolutely lobby that there are 5, regardless of what size of organization you work for. So certainly because you report to a board of directors, board support is going to be one of your first and foremost core responsibilities. A second core responsibility, because you have others that are helping you do this work, are staff or volunteers. Again, depending on the size of your organization, you may have a staff, small or large. You may also have a significant volunteer component. So the work of supporting and encouraging them is going to be a second component or core responsibility of yours. You also are expected to make it rain at your organization. You are the chief fundraiser for your organization. Again, whether you happen to have development staff that work with you, whether you have a tenured and focused fund development committee on your board, you're still the chief fundraiser. So ensuring that you've got fundraising as a part of your job and a part is how you're spending time during the week is critical in terms of success for you. A fourth component for you as an executive director is the idea of community outreach and engagement. You're often the principal individual that the community comes to, whether the community is media, whether the community is donors, whether the community is just outside supporters asking for information in terms of what you are doing, both yourself or the organization, to fulfill mission. So thinking about how you are engaging with your community in terms of outreach. And the fifth component that you have as an executive director, like it or not, are basic administrative principles and practices. The unsexy things that need to be done, like payroll, like ensuring that your donor database is updated, finances, right? Any sort of reporting, especially if you are a state agency or receiving funds from state agencies. This is the stuff that is just not so fun, but it's the stuff that has to get done, right? So there's 5 components, and you may have more based on the size of your organization, but my guess is it's going to boil down into those 5. So I want to walk you through today some pieces that are really important within each of those. And at the end of today, you can be thinking about where you may need to spend some additional time or where you may need to spend some additional resources. So I'd mentioned board support first, right? So there's an adage out there that talks about you are accountable as the executive director to the entire board, but you report to your board chair. Like, no one likes to have 7 or 11 or 22 bosses. You've got one, right? And that's your board chair. And the way that you support the board looks like this. You are an ex officio member of the board. What does that mean? It means that you serve on the board as a board member. You are non-voting because many of the items that the board is responsible for impact your job, whether that's salary or whether that's performance objectives. And so there's not a vote that you get on the board, but you absolutely are a part of the board. You're expected to be at the board meetings. You serve on all board committees, though you are not the person who chairs those committees. You are not the person that takes the minutes at those board committee meetings, but you are present. And the only time that you would not be present at a portion of a board meeting is when they go into executive session. Executive session, you would still be present at unless they are talking about your performance or whether they are talking about your salary, right? So you need to be there. And part of how you also support the board is making sure that you have a regular standing meeting with your board chair. For many of you, that means that you're going to be meeting with them once a week. I would encourage that if you are a new executive director or new to your organization. The longest amount of time that should run between meetings is like every other week. You're the conduit, right? You bring information from the organization to the board chair. The board chair brings information to you. And if you two are meeting on a regular basis and have developed a strong rapport, that then also helps to support the board, right? So there's your board support piece. The second piece that I had mentioned was staff and volunteer coaching and engagement. We've got a responsibility as executive directors to make sure that those individuals who are doing work with and for us have regular interface with us so they know what they need to do during the week. And how that ends up manifesting best is certainly them having a job description that's up to date and legitimate, but 2, you having a regular standing meeting with everyone that's in a leadership position within your organization. So if you've got one staff member, that means you're meeting with them once a week. If you've got multiples that report to you, you're going to be meeting with them once a week as well. And those meetings look like this. There's 3 components of those meetings with your staff one-on-one. First, making sure that both parties are aware of what critical work needs to be done that week. It's super important if you've got a newer staff member. The second piece is making sure that if they need you or need anything from you, you are aware of it. That could look like a report. That could look like you attending a meeting with them. That could look like some data or documents that they need in the next 3 weeks in order for them to fulfill a presentation or an obligation with the sponsor. And the last piece of that meeting with your staff or volunteer member is brainstorming any potential issues that have come up. And ideally, we want to get to a space in those meetings where it's not you that's creating the solution for the problem. You know, I had a board chair a long time ago that shared with me that my job as an executive director is not to have the answer for everything. My job is to be able to create the space to be able to get to solution. And my encouragement to you as an executive director is let's create that space with your staff member or your volunteer so they can learn how to problem solve on their own. That way, when you're out of the picture, because you're on vacation or you won Powerball and haven't told anyone, they're able to handle the problem while you're gone and the business moves on, right? So there's some ideas in terms of staff and volunteer coaching. I mentioned the fact that you are the primary rainmaker for your organization. You are the chief fundraiser. So if you're a staff of 1, you're responsible for the entire fundraising budget. Certainly there are ways for us to involve volunteers and board members in raising money for the organization. And that's a whole other podcast for another day, right? You might be lucky enough to have a development director as a part of your organization where they are actually creating the fund development plan and setting process in place so that you've got specific asks, the board has specific asks, and they have specific asks. Regardless, right, your job is to ensure that you're clear as to how much money needs to be raised in support of the budget. Your job is to raise the money. And ideally, you're doing that with an annual fund development plan that diversifies the types of revenues you're bringing in to make sure that you just aren't dependent on one type of funding for the organization. No one likes to be grant heavy. No one likes to be special events heavy. No one likes to be dependent on one particular donor to fund 75% of your organization. And it's your job, right, as the executive director, to make sure that we've got diversity of revenues, but also cash flow, right, that kind of looks like this every month instead of peaks and valleys throughout the course of the year, or that you might be in the red at different points during the year and waiting to be able to have revenues that come in. That's your job. Are there absolutely ways to be able to help bolster your skill sets and train you? For sure. Tune in, right? A couple more weeks. And I've got a podcast specifically this fall that's going to be talking about planning your fund development plan for fiscal 2024. So I also mentioned that you've got this opportunity as an executive director to be the primary external face for your organization through community outreach and engagement. Not all of us are great public speakers. Some of us would rather sit behind the computer and write grants all day or create impact reports for donors. And if you do not have a communications director at your agency, you are the primary face for the organization. Now, our job is to make sure that we share that space with the board, but ultimately you're going to end up having a communications plan that specifically talks about whom speaks to whom when they contact the office. When would it be appropriate to talk to the board chair? When would it be appropriate to talk to you? It's your job as the executive director to make sure that there's actually a media plan and a communications plan in place. There are wonderful templates online, and I'm happy to share some with you as well, where you can walk through pretty easily how we're going to communicate, whom we're going to communicate with, what we're going to communicate. I would also encourage you as the executive director to take advantage of as many free opportunities to share your why about mission and about impact with your community. And those free opportunities often look like a guest editorial in the paper, speaking at a Rotary, Kiwanis, Elks, Eagles, any civic sort of organization. Oftentimes your sponsors and benefactors have opportunities in front of their staff or employees where they're bringing in their community partners and asking to learn more about the organizations that they support. Anytime, especially if you're shy, right? Especially if you're an introvert, I would encourage you to take advantage of those opportunities. And if you are a little more loquacious and an extrovert and like to be out there, I would encourage you to share. Your job is also to share with members of the board, because the organization needs to be known by multiple individuals that work with or volunteer for you. It can't just be known for you because you're going to leave at some point in time, whether you leave temporarily because you're on vacation or you leave because you've had a change in work, right? We want to make sure that the organization is known for multiple names that are attached to it. The fifth piece that I had mentioned that's critically important for you as an executive director is that admin piece. And oftentimes the admin piece we kick to the curb or we kick down, the street because of a time management issue. And time management is something I'll be delving into a little later on this fall in another podcast episode. We oftentimes don't get to some of the most important work because we don't budget time for it. And especially if you are in a smaller shop or you do not have support staff, administrative function is one of the pieces that we let go until it's a little too late, and all of a sudden it pops up in our review. So I would encourage you to be thinking about what types of administrative functions are critical in your particular organization, and when are you budgeting time for you to do it during the week. For me, it was either Monday mornings or it was Friday afternoons, and it was always looking at financial reports. It was ensuring that our HR contractors had payroll taken care of. It was making sure our CRM was updated. And it was making sure that everything else that kind of had some loose ends were tied up so that I did not have board members, staff, or volunteers waiting for me for a particular project or an initiative to be able to get that work done. So how I'd like to be able to wrap up today, right, is for you to be able to think about three critical pieces as you launch into your work week. Number one, do these 5 categories: board support, staff and volunteer coaching, raising money for your organization, community outreach, and administrative function. Do you have different core responsibilities in your position? And if so, what are they, right? There's not a right or a wrong on this. It's identifying what those are, because as we continue to work together through this podcast, I'm going to challenge you to think about, is the work you're doing, is it falling in one of those core areas of responsibility? And if it's not, then I'm going to ask you, why are you doing it? Right? Is that really your job? And it's not because you're more or less important. Is that your job as an executive director, right? So that's homework piece 1. What are your 5 core responsibilities at your organization? Homework piece 2 is this. There's something called the nonprofit life cycle. And the nonprofit life cycle is an identifying marker that helps you get really clear, where are we at in terms of organizational cycle of work? So there's iteration 1, 2, and 3 of the life cycle. Iteration 1 is you are an organization that's 100% volunteer led. You don't even have an executive director yet. So the board is handling everything. They're handling both governance function for the organization, and they're actually having to handle the work that staff would normally do to do business operations. So that's kind of iteration 1 in life cycle. Iteration number 2 is the board has just hired an executive director, or you have a very, very small staff, like 1 or 2 staff people. So the board is transitioning to do more of governance, and they're handing off some of the operational work to the executive director and staff. This is oftentimes where things get messy for nonprofits because the board is so used to doing both. They're used to doing both governance and operations that they overstep and do some micromanaging, right? So that's iteration number 2. And iteration number 3 is what I would call a really healthy and balanced nonprofit where you've got the board most days playing in the governance world and the executive director and their team playing in the implementation and operational aspects of the organization. So I want you to think about, where are you? Are you in iteration 1, 2, or 3? And the last thing I'd like you to think about as we close out for today is this. Where do you as an executive director need additional support in those 5 areas, right, that I mentioned, if any? Is it board support? Is it fundraising? Is it staff and volunteer coaching? Is it community outreach? Is it admin? I'd love to hear from you in terms of where you might be struggling or where you might need some additional support. And you're welcome to be able to get that information to me via my website, insightconsultinggroup.com, or via email at kari@insightconsultinggroup.com. As I sign off for the day, I want to make sure that you follow me on the particular podcast channel of your choice and welcome you to engage in social media as well. I'm thankful for your time, and I'll look forward to you tuning back in for the next episode in a couple weeks. Take care.